Good evening, friends, and welcome to Sleepy-Time Tales, a podcast aimed at helping you to get a good night's sleep. Do you find your mind plagued with the stresses of modern life, especially when the lights are out and you're trying to get a restful night? Does your spinning mind keep you awake? Follow my voice down the path towards a good night's rest. Listen to me tell a story that will keep your mind from wandering to your daytime problems, the ones you can't solve right now, and will be easier to solve well rested. Listen to my voice and allow yourself to drift, following the twists and turns of the story, but slowly letting go and drifting into sleep. So what exactly is Sleepy-Time Tales? What is it for? What is this strange idea, this strange thing, this podcast that you're supposed to fall asleep to? But lack of sleep is a health crisis in the 21st century, and this is a podcast intended to help those that it can to get a restful night. Do you find yourself lying awake at night, mind spinning and emotions in turmoil with anxieties of 21st century life? Do you wake up in the middle of the night and find yourself not quite able to doze back off at 3 a.m.? I'm here to help. My name is Dave, and I'm your narrator, here to help you into a restful night. Sleepy-Time Tales is intended to be used as a distraction to what keeps you awake at night, or sometimes background noise or simply company. That's why I make these episodes quite long, so that I'm here for you, without any pressure of the end coming. Now, as far as I know, there are a couple of different ways to engage with the show. The primary idea is that it gives you something to focus on, a story or an event that lets you keep your mind on a specific point, to stop it from spinning out into stress and anxieties, to help you to focus just enough not to resist the embrace of a night's sleep. But maybe you need something a bit different. Some people just need some kind of background noise. Maybe white noise, pink noise, the sound of the ocean, sound of the rain, wind in the trees, or maybe just some boring dude droning on in the background. And as you're listening, don't force the sleep. Just keep a light mental grip on the thread of the story and allow the need for sleep to come for you naturally. Now, obviously, I hope that you're asleep before I get to the end of the episode, but it's important you don't feel pressurized. If this is your first night with us, it probably actually won't work for you. I recommend giving it a solid 3 nights try to see if you can get used to it. To get used to listening to my voice, maybe my accent is strange, maybe the idea of letting someone talk to you while you sleep is odd, or maybe one episode just isn't long enough. Or maybe your problem isn't so much going to sleep. Maybe your problem is waking up in the middle of the night. What I recommend, because it's what works for me, is to let the podcast run all night. Download a whole bunch of episodes, long enough to run through the night and then a little bit more. Put them all in a playlist, start on the latest and let them go. That way, if you wake up in the middle of the night and you're staring at the ceiling, you can just carry on listening and allow yourself to go straight back to sleep again. You can even do the same thing if you regularly wake up before your alarm. 60 minutes or as little as 30 minutes. Carry on listening, go back to sleep again. And you may wonder what the point is, because after all, what good is an extra 60 minutes or 30 minutes of sleep? But I've had people thank me for telling them to do this, or suggesting this rather, because there is something about allowing yourself complete relaxation right before the alarm that's satisfying on a whole new level. So relax, listen to the show. If you're new to the show and prone to late nights lying staring at the ceiling, this may seem strange to you, so give it a chance. Because I'm here to work with you, to create a safe space, a cocoon in which you can curl up and allow nature to take its course. So if you're still with me, thank you for staying. If you're already asleep, we'll chat again soon. And of course, you aren't hearing me, except maybe in a dream. Before we get on with the show, I'd like to ask for a couple of minutes of your time. I've mentioned a couple of times now that I left my job recently to focus full-time on podcast editing and production. So if you or someone you know would like to start a podcast, or has one, but you're struggling to get everything done, I can do most of the editing and admin tasks, including taking control of the full launch, which is something I'm helping a few people with at the moment. That's registering in all of the nearly dozen places you need to be to have an optimal launch, setting up your podcast email, show art, the whole deal. So get in touch with my email in the episode notes for a free consultation, and I'll get you going in the right direction. And we can see how I can take the pressure off you so that you can focus on the fun stuff and spend your time doing more interesting things than audio editing and podcast admin. And also, if you'd like to support Sleepy Time Tales directly, to keep it going out to thousands of insomniacs just like you, please consider supporting on Patreon at patreon.com/sleepytimetales. This is a monthly support that not only helps me keep the lights on, but can also get you fun bonuses based on your contribution level. From as little as $2 a month, you can get some cool rewards, as well as helping keep this show going. And if monthly is a big ask, then you can always make once-off tips through the tip jar on the website. Huge shout out to Emily, who threw some money in the tip jar recently. It's a huge help, and I'm very grateful for the support. Being in South Africa, one big advantage is $1 goes quite far, so any contribution is very much appreciated. And as I said, I'm grateful. Thank you very much, Emily. I also have some merchandise up on the TeePublic store, which you can reach through the show notes or via the website at sleepytimetales.net. I actually suppose a lot of the stuff, probably strictly speaking, isn't merchandise. Most of it isn't even Sleepy Time Tales branded. It's just like cool designs that I came up with that I think are fun and handy, especially as stickers or maybe pillowcase covers and stuff like that. Also very on brand for Sleepy Time Tales. And of course, another way to help out the show is simply to spread the word. If you know someone who you think will benefit from listening to Sleepy Time Tales, just tell them about it. Spreading the word will help me to do my small part and help us to do our small part to improve people's lives. Last but not least, of course, shout out to the music, which is Sweet Night and Friends by Kumiku. The music is available on their website at loyaltyfreakmusic.com. Thank you very much, and let's get back to the show. We continue this week with The Elements of Geology by William Harmon Norton. And we pick up where we left off, talking about underground supplies of water. Thermal springs. While the lower limit of surface drainage is at sea level, subterranean water circulates much below that depth and is brought again to the surface by hydrostatic pressure. In many instances, springs have a higher temperature than the average annual temperature of the region, and are then known as thermal springs. In regions of present or recent volcanic activity, such as Yellowstone National Park, we may believe that the heat of thermal springs is derived from uncooled lavas, perhaps not far below the surface. But when hot springs occur at a distance of hundreds of miles from any volcano, as in the case of hot springs of Bath, England, it is probable that their waters have risen from the heated rocks of the Earth's interior. The springs of Bath have a temperature of 150 degrees Fahrenheit, 70 degrees above the average annual temperature of the place. If we assume that the rate of increase in the Earth's internal heat is here the average rate, 1 degree Fahrenheit to every 60 feet of descent, we may conclude that the springs of Bath rise from at least a depth of 4,200 feet. Water may descend to depths from which it can never be brought back by hydrostatic pressure. It is absorbed by highly heated rocks deep below the surface. From time to time, some of this deep-seated water may be returned to the open air in the steam of volcanic eruptions. Surface deposits of springs. Where subterranean water returns to the surface, highly charged with minerals in solution, on exposure to the air it is commonly compelled to lay down much of its invisible load in chemical deposits about the spring. These are thrown down from solution either because of cooling, evaporation, loss of carbon dioxide, or the work of algae. Many springs have been charged under pressure with carbon dioxide from subterranean sources, and are able therefore to take up large quantities of lime carbonate from the limestone rocks through which they pass. On reaching the surface, the pressure is relieved, the gas escapes, and the lime carbonate is thrown down in deposits called travertine. The gas is sometimes withdrawn, and the deposit produced in large part by the action of algae and other humble forms of plant life. At the Mammoth Hot Springs in the valley of the Gardner River, Yellowstone National Park, beautiful terraces and basins of travertine are now building, chiefly by means of algae which cover the bottoms, rims and sides of the basins, and deposit lime carbonate upon them in successive sheets. The rock, snow-white where dry, is coated with red and orange gelatinous mats where the algae thrive in the overflowing waters. Similar terraces of travertine are found to a height of 1,400 feet up the valley side. We may infer that the springs which formed these ancient deposits discharged near what was then the bottom of the valley, and that as the valley has been deepened by the river, the groundwater of the region has found lower and lower points of issue. In many parts of the country, calcareous springs occur which coat with lime carbonate, mosses, twigs, and other objects over which the waters flow. Such are popularly known as petrifying springs, although they merely encrust the objects and do not convert them into stone. Silica is soluble in alkaline waters, especially when these are hot. Hot springs rising through alkaline siliceous rocks, such as lavas, often deposit silica in a white spongy formation known as siliceous sinter, both by evaporation and by the action of algae which secrete silica from the waters. It is in this way that the cones and mounds of the geysers in Yellowstone National Park and in Iceland have been formed. Where water oozes from the earth, one may sometimes see a rusty deposit on the ground, and perhaps an iridescent scum upon the water. The scum is often mistaken for oil, but at a touch it cracks and breaks as oil would not do. It is a film of hydrogenated iron oxide, or limonite, and the spring is an iron or chalybeate spring. Compounds of iron have been taken into solution by groundwater from soil and rocks, and are now changed to the insoluble oxide on exposure to the oxygen of the air. In wet ground, iron compounds leached by groundwater from the soil often collect in reddish deposits a few feet below the surface, where their downward progress is arrested by some impervious clay. At the bottom of bogs and shallow lakes, iron ores sometimes accumulate to a depth of several feet. Decaying organic matter plays a large part in these changes. In its presence, the insoluble iron oxides which give color to most red and yellow rocks are decomposed, leaving the rocks of a grey or bluish color, and the soluble iron compounds which result are readily leached out. Effects seen where red or yellow clays have been bleached about some decaying tree root. The iron thus dissolved is laid down as limonite when oxidized, as about a chalybeate spring, but out of contact with the air and in the presence of carbon dioxide supplied by decaying vegetation, as in a peat bog, it may be deposited as iron carbonate or siderite. Total amount of underground waters. In order to realize the vast work in solution and cementation which underground waters are now doing, and have done in all geological ages, we must gain some conception of their amount. At a certain depth, estimated at about 6 miles, the weight of the crust becomes greater than the rocks can bear, and all cavities and pores in them must be completely closed by the enormous pressure which they sustain. Below a depth of even 3 or 4 miles, it is believed that groundwater cannot circulate. Estimating the average pore spaces of the different rocks of the Earth's crust above this depth, and the average percents of their pore spaces occupied by water, it has been recently computed that the total amount of groundwater is equal to a sheet of water 100 feet deep, covering the entire surface of the Earth. Chapter 3. Rivers and Valleys. The runoff. We have traced the history of that portion of the rainfall which soaks into the ground. Let us now return to that part which washes along the surface and is known as the runoff. Fed by rains and melting snows, the runoff gathers into courses, perhaps but faintly marked at first, which join more definite and deeply cut channels as twigs their stems. In a humid climate, the larger ravines through which the runoff flows soon descend below the groundwater surface. Here springs discharge along the sides of the little valleys, and permanent streams begin. The water supplied by the runoff here joins that part of the rainfall which had soaked into the soil, and both now proceed together by the way of the stream to the sea. River floods. Streams vary greatly in volume during the year. At stages of flood, they fill their immediate banks or overrun them and inundate any lowlands adjacent to the channel. At stages of low water, they diminish to but a fraction of their volume when at flood. At times of flood, rivers are fed chiefly by the runoff. At times of low water, largely or even wholly by springs. How then will the water of streams differ at these times in turbidity and in the relative amount of solids carried in solution? In parts of England, streams have been known to continue flowing after 18 months of local drought. So great is the volume of water which in humid climates is stored in the rocks above the drainage level, and so slowly is it given off in springs. In Illinois and the states adjacent, rivers remain low in winter, and a spring freshet follows the melting of the winter's snow. A June rise is produced by the heavy rains of early summer. Low water follows in July and August, and streams are again swollen to a moderate degree under the rains of autumn. The discharge of streams. The percent of rainfall discharged by rivers varies with the amount of rainfall. The slope of the drainage area, the texture of the rocks, and other factors With an annual rainfall of 50 inches in an open country, about 50% is discharged, while with a rainfall of 20 inches, only 15% is discharged, part of the remainder being evaporated and part passing underground beyond the drainage area. Thus, the Ohio discharges 30% of the rainfall of its basin, while the Missouri carries away but 15%. A number of the streams of the semi-arid lands of the West do not discharge more than 5% of the rainfall. Other things being equal, which will afford the greater proportion of runoff: a region underlain with granite rock or with coarse sandstone, grassland or forest, steep slopes or level land, a well-drained region or one abounding in marshes and ponds, frozen or unfrozen ground. Will there be a larger proportion of runoff after the long rains or after a season of drought, after long and gentle rain, or after the same amount of precipitation and of violent rain during the months of growing vegetation, from June to August, or during the autumn months? Desert streams. In arid regions, the groundwater surface lies so low that for the most part streamways do not intersect it. Streams, therefore, are not fed by springs, but instead lose volume as their waters soak into the thirsty rocks over which they flow. They contribute to the groundwater of the region instead of being increased by it. Being supplied chiefly by the runoff, they wither at times of drought to a mere trickle of water, to a chain of pools, or go wholly dry, while at long intervals rain fills their dusty beds with sudden raging torrents. Desert rivers therefore periodically shorten and lengthen their courses, withering back at times of drought for scores of miles, or even for 100 miles from the point reached by their waters during seasons of rain. The geological work of streams. The work of streams is of three kinds: transportation, erosion, and deposition. Streams transport the waste of the land. They wear or erode their channels both on bed and banks, and they deposit portions of their load from time to time along their courses, finally laying it down in the sea. Most of the work of streams is done at times of flood. Transportation. The invisible load of streams. Of the waste which a river transports, we may consider first the invisible load which it carries in solution, supplied chiefly by springs, but also in part by the runoff, and from the solution of the rocks of its bed. More than half the dissolved solids in the water of the average river consist of the carbonates of lime and magnesia. Other substances are gypsum, sodium sulfate, magnesium sulfate, sodium chloride, and even silica, the least soluble of the common rock-making minerals. The amount of this invisible load is surprisingly large. The Mississippi, for example, transports each year 113 million tons of dissolved rock to the Gulf. The visible load of streams. This consists of the silt which the stream carries in suspension, and the sand and gravel and larger stones which it pushes along its bed. Especially in times of flood, one may note the muddy water, its silt being kept from settling by the rolling, eddying currents. And often by placing his ear close to the bottom of a boat, one may hear the clatter of pebbles as they are hurried along. In mountain torrents, the rumble of boulders as they clash together may be heard some distance away. The amount of the load which a stream can transport depends on its velocity. A current of 2/3 of a mile per hour can move fine sand, while one of 4 miles per hour sweeps along pebbles as large as hen's eggs. The transporting power of a stream varies as the sixth power of its velocity. If its velocity is multiplied by 2, its transporting power is multiplied by the sixth power of 2. It can now move stones 64 times as large as it could before. Stones weigh from 2 to 3 times as much as water, and in water lose the weight of the volume of water which they displace. What proportion then of their weight in air do stones lose when submerged? Measurement of stream loads. To obtain the total amount of waste transported by a river, it is an important but difficult matter. The amount of water discharged must first be found by multiplying the number of square feet in the average cross-section of the stream by its velocity per second, giving the discharge per second in cubic feet. The amount of silt to cubic foot of water is found by filtering samples of the water taken from different parts of the stream and at different times in the year, and drying and weighing the residues. The average amount of silt to the cubic foot of water, multiplied by the number of cubic feet of water discharged per year, gives the total load carried in suspension during that time. Adding to this the estimated amount of sand and gravel rolled along the bed, which in many swift rivers greatly exceeds the lighter material held in suspension, and adding also to the total amount of dissolved solids, we reach the exceedingly important result of the total load of waste discharged by the river. Dividing the volume of this load by the area of the river basin gives another result of the greatest geological interest. The rate at which the region is being lowered by the combined action of weathering and erosion, or the rate of denudation. The rate of denudation of river basins. This rate varies widely. The Mississippi Basin may be taken as a representative land surface because of the varieties of surface, altitude and slope, climate, and underlying rocks, which are included in its great extent. Careful measurements show that the Mississippi Basin is now being lowered at a rate of 1/4000th of a foot a year, or 1 foot in 4,000 years. Taking this as the average rate of denudation for the land surfaces of the globe, estimates have been made of the length of time required at this rate to wash and wear the continents to the level of the sea. As the average elevation of the lands of the globe is reckoned at 2,411 feet, this result would occur in 9 or 10 million years, if the present rate of denudation should remain unchanged. But even if no movements of the earth crust should lift or depress the continents, the rate of wear and the removal of waste from their surfaces will not remain the same. It must constantly decrease as the lands are worn nearer to sea level, and their slopes become more gentle. The length of time required to wear them away is therefore far in excess of that just stated. The drainage area of the Potomac is 11,000 square miles. The silt brought down in suspension in a year would cover a square mile to the depth of 4 feet. At what rate is the Potomac Basin being lowered from this cause alone? It is estimated that the upper Ganges is lowering its basin at the rate of 1 foot in 823 years, and the Po 1 foot in 720 years. Why so much faster than the Potomac and the Mississippi? How streams get their loads. The load of streams is derived from a number of sources. the larger part being supplied by the weathering of valley slopes. We have noticed how the mantle of waste creeps and washes to the streamways. Watching the runoff during a rain, as it hurries muddy with waste along the gutter or washes down the hillside, we may see the beginning of the route by which the larger part of their load is delivered to rivers. Streams also secure some of their load by wearing it from their beds and banks, a process called erosion. Streams erode their beds chiefly by means of their bottom load, the stones of various sizes and the sand, and even the fine mud which they sweep along. With these tools they smooth, grind, and rasp the rock of their beds, using them in much the fashion of sandpaper or a file. Weathering of riverbeds. The erosion of stream beds is greatly helped by the work of the weather. Especially at low water, more or less of the bed is exposed to the action of frost and heat and cold. Joints are opened, rocks are pried loose, and broken up and made ready to be swept away by the stream at time of flood. Potholes. In rapids, streams also draw out their rocky beds. Where some slight depression gives rise to an eddy, the pebbles which gather in it are whirled round and round, and acting like the bit of an auger bore out a cylindrical pit called a pothole. Potholes sometimes reach a depth of a score of feet. Where they are numerous, they aid materially in deepening the channel, as the walls between them are worn away and they coalesce. Waterfalls. One of the most effective means of erosion which the river possesses is the waterfall. The plunging water dislodges stones from the face of the ledge over which it pours, and often undermines it by excavating a deep pit at its base. Slice after slice is thus thrown down from the front of the cliff, and the cataract cuts its way upstream, leaving a gorge behind it. Niagara Falls. The Niagara River flows from Lake Erie at Buffalo in a broad channel, which it has cut but a few feet below the level of the region. Some 13 miles from the outlet, it plunges over a ledge 170 feet high into the head of a narrow gorge, which extends for 7 miles to the escarpment of the upland in which the gorge is cut. The strata which compose the upland dip gently upstream and consist atop of a mass of limestone, at the falls about 80 feet thick and below of soft, easily weathered shale. Beneath the falls, the underlying shale is cut and washed away by the descending water, and retreats also because of weathering, while the overhanging limestone breaks down in huge blocks from time to time. Niagara is divided by Goat Island into the Horseshoe Falls and the American Falls. The former is supplied by the main current of the river, and from the semicircular sweep of its rim a sheet of water in places at least 15 or 20 feet deep plunges into a pool a little less than 200 feet in depth. Here the force of the falling water is sufficient to move about the fallen blocks of limestone, and to use them in the excavation of the shale of the bed. At the American Falls, the lesser branch of the river, which flows along the American side of Goat Island, pours over the side of the gorge and breaks upon a high talus of limestone blocks, which its smaller volume of water is unable to grind to pieces and remove. A series of surveys have determined that from 1842 to 1890, the Horseshoe Falls retreated at the rate of 2.18 feet per year, while the American Falls retreated at the rate of 0.64 feet in the same period. We cannot doubt that the same agency which is now lengthening the gorge at this rapid rate has cut it back its entire length of 7 miles. While Niagara Falls have been cutting back a gorge 7 miles long and from 200 to 300 feet deep, the river above the falls has eroded its bed scarcely below the level of the upland on which it flows. Like all streams which are outlets of lakes, the Niagara flows out of Lake Erie clear of sediment, as from a settling basin, and carries no tools with which to abrade its bed. We may infer from this instance how slight is the erosive power of clear water on hard rock. Deposition. While the river carries its invisible load of dissolved rock on without stop to the sea, its load of visible waste is subject to many delays en route. Now and again it is laid aside, to be picked up later and carried some distance further on its way. One of the most striking features of the river, therefore, is the waste accumulated along its course, in bars and islands in the channel, beneath its bed and in floodplains along its banks. All this alluvium, to use a general term for river deposits, with which the valley is cumbered, is really en route to the sea. It is only temporarily laid aside to resume its journey later on. Constantly the river is destroying and rebuilding its alluvial deposits, here cutting and there depositing along its banks, here eroding and there building a bar, here excavating its bed and there filling it up, and at all times carrying the material picked up at one point some distance on downstream before depositing it at another. These deposits are laid down by slackening currents where the velocity of the stream is checked, as on the inner side of curves, and where the slope of the bed is diminished, and in the lee of islands, bridge piers, and projecting points of land. How slight is the check required to cause a current to drop a large part of its load may be inferred from the law of the relation of the transporting power to the velocity. If the velocity is decreased 1/2, the current can move fragments, but 1/64 the size of those which it would move before, and must drop all those of larger size. Stratification. River deposits are stratified, and may be seen in any fresh cut in banks or bars. The waste of which they are built has been sorted and deposited in layers, one above another, some of finer and some of coarser material. The sorting action of running water depends on the fact that its transporting power varies with the velocity. A current whose diminishing velocity compels it to drop coarse gravel, for example, is still able to move all its finer waste of its load, and separating it from the gravel, carries it on downstream. While at a later time, slower currents may deposit on the gravel bed layers of sand, and still later slack water may leave on these a layer of mud. In case of materials lighter than water, the transporting power does not depend on the velocity, and logs of wood, for instance, are floated on to the sea at the slowest, as well as on the most rapid currents. Crossbedding. A section of a bar exposed at low water may show that it is formed of layers of sand, or coarser stuff, inclined downstream as steeply often as the angle of repose of the material. From a boat anchored over the lower end of a submerged sandbar, we may observe the way in which the structure, called crossbedding, is produced. Sand is continually pushed over the edge of the bar at B and comes to rest in successive layers on the sloping surface. At the same time, the bar may be worn away at the upper end, and thus slowly advance downstream. While the deposit is thus cross-bedded, it constitutes as a whole a stratum whose upper and lower surfaces are about horizontal. In sections of riverbanks, one may often see a vertical succession of cross-bedded strata, each built in the way described. Waterware. The coarser material of river deposits, such as cobblestones, gravel, and the larger grains of sand, are water-worn or rounded, except when near their source. Rolling along the bottom, they have been worn round by impact and friction, as they rub together against one another and the rocky bed of the stream. Experiments have shown that angular fragments of granite lose nearly half their weight and become well-rounded after traveling 15 miles in rotating cylinders, partly filled with water. Marbles are cheaply made in Germany out of small limestone cubes, set revolving in a current of water between a rotating bed of stone and a block of oak, the process requiring but about 15 minutes. It has been found that in the upper reaches of mountain streams, a descent of less than a mile is sufficient to ground pebbles of granite. And with that interesting little bit of trivia, I think I'm going to call it a night. As always, if you want to pick up where we've left off, you can find their original on Project Gutenberg at the link in the show notes. Thanks again for joining me on this episode of Sleepy Time Tales, the podcast designed around a bedtime story to help you to get a restful night. New episodes would be released every Sunday night to give you something fresh to help you rest in a new week. But make sure to subscribe in whatever service you use so that you get your new episodes whenever they come out. A reminder that the music for tonight is Sweet Night and Friends by Kumiku. Check out more of their work on their website, which you'll find linked in the show notes. Good night, and sweet dreams.